Okay. Our deep yoga breath. Great. All right. Well, welcome everyone to Blooducation Baristas. We are your hosts, Daniela Hermelin and Monica Pagano, offering you piping hot transfusion news using the social media channels. These episodes are brought to you by transfusionnews.com, so make sure you subscribe to Transfusion News Question of the Day. All right, now here's my partner, Monica. Welcome.
Gracias, Daniela. Bienvenidos todos a este nuevo episodio de Blood Education Baristas, donde discutimos los tópicos más importantes en el momento. Estos episodios están traídos hacia ustedes por Transfusion News y como ustedes saben, existen las preguntas del día en español. Si no tienen acceso, por favor, contáctenos y les daremos el acceso. Daniela.
Well, thank you, Monica. I'm so glad we were able to come together today. And, there was some activity happening this summer where there were some outbreaks of malaria in the United States, in Florida, in Texas, and actually in the end in Baltimore, Maryland. So there was a lot of activity. We got brought together as a transfusion medicine community about what was happening. And I think that this brought us to be thinking about some of the transfusion transmitted diseases that can occur with mosquitoes. So we brought together a group of experts to help us think about this, to talk about this. Hopefully we'll go from mosquitoes to maybe some other zoonotic diseases. But please help to introduce the fantastic expert panelists we brought on today.
Yes, thank you, Daniela. As you said, this is kind of a new topic it's an all new topic in terms of malaria and mosquitoes and everything that goes with it. So we have three excellent panelists today. We are very fortunate in having Dr. Susan Stramer, who is the Vice President of Scientific Affairs at the American Red Cross and an expert on emerging pathogens and the safety of the blood supply. We also have Dr. Lou Katz, who is a board-certified internist and infectious disease specialist with a strong interest in transfusion-transmitted diseases. And last but not least, we have our international expert, Dr. Silvano Wendell, all the way from Brazil, who is the medical director of the Blood Bank Center at the Sírio-Libanese Hospital in Brazil and former president of the International Society for Blood Transfusion. Dr. Wendell has an extensive experience in transfusion-transmitted diseases.
Thank you.
Thanks, Monica. And thank you for all of you for joining us today. We're going to get started with Dr. Susan Stramer. Susan, help us get this conversation started. We're going to be focusing now on thinking about the foundation of this topic, maybe even focusing on some of our younger learners. Can you help us understand what infectious disease we screen for of our donors in the United States, really focusing on mosquito-borne illnesses?
Sure. Thank you very much for the introduction. Let me just correct you to say that I've retired from my position at the Red Cross, and I'm kind of freelance individual right now, an emerging second career, kind of like following the bugs. So, and also we were focused on mosquitoes, but as we know, globally and within the United States, we need to be worried about tick vectors and perhaps other vectors. I don't know if we'll get into Chagas disease, but they're all important, and ranges are expanding with the pressures we have from climate change. But currently in the United States, we do conventional testing. I call it conventional HIV, HBV, HCV. We do serology and NAT. We've been doing this forever. And the first real emerging pathogen that we dealt with, I'm not going to talk about Chagas as emerging because Chagas really has been around for a long, long time. But West Nile is the first thing that we really focused on in 1999. There were some introductions in New York City, And then by 2002, the virus had exploded throughout the entire country. The rest of the world is a little behind us in maybe environmental conditions or other conditions that favor the rapid expansion. But in the United States, West Nile just rapidly expanded. With one carefully designed study from the CDC on an organ transplant recipient who received blood, we were able to document that West Nile was transfusion transmitted. And this was really noteworthy because it was the first time, other than malaria, we really documented a mosquito-borne agent to be transfusion transmitted. Within 9 months, we were screening for West Nile, and the rest of West Nile is history. It's really hard to predict where West Nile occurs year to year. Where the reservoir birds are, where the vectors are, the mosquitoes. But then then Zika hit us about the same way. So we began Zika testing under an investigational protocols, and then nationwide, transmitted again by mosquitoes. But what was significant about Zika was non-conventional transmissions and the fact of the impact on pregnant women. So that was quite, put a lot of pressure on us as a blood community. What was good is that Zika disappeared, and we were able, with the assistance of the FDA, to stop testing. And the last one that we've dealt with, although Babesia has been around like Chagas for a long time and slowly expanding, but that's not a mosquito-borne, that's a tick-borne disease. We finally did implement testing in endemic states for Babesia. So that kind of lays the landscape in the US, which, as we'll hear, is quite different from the rest of the world. Let me just say, we do screen, quote unquote, for malaria, but that's by way of donor questioning, assuming the donors remembered where they traveled, when they traveled, where they lived, how long they've lived here relative to an endemic area, and if they've had malaria. So that's been in place for a very long time, but it's donor screening, not donation screening.
I really appreciate you providing that overview. And, this summer, I get the emails of West Nile virus confirmed positives, and it feels like it's pouring West Nile virus this year. So thanks for providing that background in the United States. I would love to hear Dr. Wendell Silvano, what is it like in your country? How is it different? How do you approach donor disease testing for these mosquito-borne vectors?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the invitation. Hello to everybody. There are similarities and different things in a tropical country like Brazil. First of all, we were expecting West Nile, and it really never happened in Brazil. Even though we do have the birds flying from North America to South America and vice versa, but they never. West Nile is not a problem in Brazil. We are still looking for that, but not a menace or a threat to the blood supply. Chagas disease is not a mosquito-borne disease. It used to be a major problem, which is under control now. And malaria, Brazil has two main regions: the northern part of Brazil, the Amazon region, which is endemic for malaria, and the southern part of Brazil, which we only have autochthonous cases. I live in São Paulo, a very developed area from southern part of Brazil. And to be very honest, we do have maybe a couple of autochthonous cases per year in this region. And 40 years of experience in my region, I only saw one case of transitional malaria in my region, although in the northern part there should be more. What has become a new procedure, and we also have donor questioning as any country, but we are trying to validate or estimate a new NAT test for malaria for donations, which is still, I would say, in the early stages, but it was quite interesting because some data from the Amazon shows lots of donors infected, but actually we don't see the transfusional cases. So we do have infected donors. And recently in the city of Rio de Janeiro, totally asymptomatic donors, some with endemic, coming from endemic regions, and others completely unknown from previous exposures, found to be reactive by NAT, although look back studies didn't show anything about that. So I think it is very important for us to recognize that malaria is a transitional problem, but not all donors who are infected or are found as infected by the malaria or the plasmodium might transmit to the recipients in 100% of cases. So I think there's a gap between infectious donors and infection in recipients. Then we can discuss later on about how to prevent those cases. So that's it. And of course, we had dengue, Zika, but Zika has vanished. We don't have Zika as a major problem now, although it was a major problem. Dengue, when we had the COVID, dengue disappeared. Now it's back, but again, with no real transfusional threat to us at this moment.
Thank you, Silvano. That's a very informative answer. And I can see if there is one thing that I can take is about the complexity and the dynamics, right, of these viruses and parasites, depending on the different regions of the country, even within the same country, and also how unpredictable they are. So with that in mind, I have a question for Lou. Lou, this question is about, with all these dynamic and considerations and variations in the activities of these viruses and parasites and so on, when do you start considering that this pathogen actually poses a threat to the blood supply?
Well, it's something that has occupied folks at AABB, Sue and myself and Roger and lots of people. When do you pull the trigger? And I think Sue and Roger actually published a manuscript maybe 10 years ago that kind of proposed an algorithm for when to think about things. But at the end of the day, as an infection is recognized or emerges, or we start to think about it, it requires that we understand, first, it's a human pathogen. Second, that it might be present in the blood and survive modern processing up to and including pathogen reduction. Find a susceptible host. So if you infuse a potentially infectious unit into a patient that they're not immune or they're susceptible in whatever way that the parenteral route, which is not the natural route of most zoonoses, can be infectious and then cause disease. So you can see it's really complicated and at certain points very subjective. Somebody has to say, geez, this person got a transfusion 2 weeks ago and now they've got pathogen X. I wonder if the transfusion is the source. Really astute clinicians are critical, in addition to all the public health infrastructure that we might want to bring to bear. And it's not simple. I mean, we worried about Zika because it did horrible things to little babies. And we studied it and we intervened. And at the end of the day, we know about 4 or 5 apparent transfusions that produced no morbidity in the recipients. Silvano's colleagues in Brazil and at Reds did a very fascinating sort of look back study for dengue and could attribute very little morbidity. So the idea that the parenteral route will produce disease is important to consider, but at the bottom line is somebody has to think about it. Somebody has to recognize a risk and then start looking for those outcomes, and it's not simple.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Lou. It seems that it is certainly a combination between the donor and the recipient, as usually in transfusion medicine. That's kind of the clue. Silvano, just to follow up on your previous comment and with Lou mentioning about how vigilant we are for these pathogens. In terms of in Brazil, as you were mentioning, differences in acute versus chronic infections, the north and the south. So how do you monitor this? How do you deal with this chronic endemic malaria in the northern part? Is there any particular strategy that you have developed?
You mean in public health system or transfusional? Public health.
Public health, yes.
Wow, public health it's impossible to eradicate mosquitoes in the Amazon. The Amazon area is huge. It's maybe 4 million square kilometers. So you cannot do it by controlling the mosquitoes. So you have to follow some procedures. There is also the clinical awareness of people who become infected and treat them immediately. But there are several people that are immune or partially immune. Therefore, the clinical situation is quite different. Whereas in the southern part of the country, there were several procedures in order to control the mosquitoes. But once again, you cannot control mosquitoes. You just have to somehow be aware whether they are in a given incidence or density, and then you increase your public health procedures. And you have to be alert. So vigilance is paramount if you live in an endemic area. And it's quite interesting. I learned many years ago that the main culprit of malaria actually are not the mosquitoes, but the humans. So we infect the mosquitoes. So since you cannot either kill the mosquitoes totally or kill the reservoir, so it's a balance that you have to work continuously. And like Lou said, it's a very difficult and daily attitude that you have to carry on.
Well, Susan, were you going to say something?
No, I mean, it's just in every comment there, we could go on to a lot of conversations, whether vaccines are the answer. We've never had a vaccine for malaria. There are other vector-borne agents that have successful vaccines like yellow fever or tick-borne encephalitis. And, Silvano mentioned in Brazil, I mean, there are huge yellow fever outbreaks. That's another transfusion-transmitted agent.
Yep.
And we've never even thought about screening for yellow fever. It's just the balance that we seek, or the way the mosquitoes infect us is so different, even though you think of the inoculum size relative to a transfusion as minuscule. But the mosquitoes have the advantage. This is the natural cycle. And someone already said, maybe it was you, the transfusion is not a natural way to get infected with these agents. But the mosquitoes over time know how to infect us, know how to create a reservoir. Silvano says we are the reservoir for malaria. But with their saliva, they have all kinds of proteins that prevent clotting, that allow the inoculum to be introduced, and allow or favor infection in the host. So, I mean, the dynamics and the biology is so different. Also, Silvano said you can't get rid of the mosquitoes in the Amazon. Well, maybe we think we would want to, but bats and other creatures, I mean, we would disrupt the entire ecosystem. Maybe we don't think we need bats either.
Yeah.
But I mean, they each night they devour, I don't know, millions and millions of mosquitoes.
Yeah. I think that the difference in an IV dose with a transfusion of dengue versus what happens when a mosquito puts the virus into the skin is just fascinating. And I'm absolutely certain that the reason that it's relatively efficient by mosquito bite has to do with mosquito spit. And that's not present when you infuse it IV. And there's pathogenic differences that we just really don't have a great handle on that go into thinking about these things. It's fascinating stuff. And if I was younger, maybe I'd go back to the lab and study mosquito spit.
You know, another limitation when we study recipients, many of them are very, very ill. So the confounding symptomology, or what we would look for a transfusion transmitted infection, it's very difficult. And Lou mentioned the dengue rat study. You know, that it was complicated too, because these patients are so ill, it's hard to know when there's something has been added on top of what their underlying conditions are. So, you know, an astute clinician is really critical. I mean, there have been very few dengue transfusion transmissions relative to the presence of dengue that have been published, but there have got to be, you know, just zillions more, and just not recognized, not published, just like with any transfusion transmitted infection. There really has to be a signal for that to be investigated, you know, at the right place, at the right time, by the right individuals.
Yeah. And with COVID, the signal was we found RNA, right, in the blood. And we spent a lot of resources on an event that would have been unprecedented, which is a respiratory virus causing significant disease when given parenterally. We had the examples of both MERS and SARS-1, but we spent a lot of time thinking about SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 because there was a signal. We found RNA in blood, ergo, the potential arises. And those kinds of signals are important, but they're not necessarily predictive. It's just very difficult and requires careful thought.
Well, take us through that journey then. You find a signal, you have either astute physicians bringing this to our attention. Then what does it look like? How do you take it from there? Which committees are responsible for taking that signal and moving it forward? And what do we do with it?
Well, Sue, you published algorithm, so.
Well, I mean, it's a combination of, you know, there are many directions we can go. I mean, this public health, at least in the United States, this FDA via public health drive what we do via CDC. State public health will investigate and they'll report to CDC, and then CDC will meet with FDA. So we have a regulatory pathway that we could pursue. We also have a blood center pathway. I mean, many of these agents, we introduced testing before there was a requirement to do testing. Chagas disease being notable. I mean, we knew, and babesia, we knew these things have been around forever, and we have the tools to do so, which is another avenue. We have to have the tools if we're going to introduce an intervention. So the blood providers can introduce an intervention before there's a regulatory or public health requirement to do so. So it's really a balance depending on, you know, what blood centers believe the public would demand and expect in keeping the blood supply safe. And also, you know, how much force we get from public health or we get from the FDA. It's going to be a lot different outside of the US, where there isn't a central force, if you will, like the FDA. Whereas the European countries, if you read what they do for dengue and West Nile, or how they do surveillance, it's so much more, you know, in my opinion, so much more complicated, because, you know, they have a little area in Italy or a little area in France that has chikungunya, or dengue or West Nile, and so they stop collections there. Well, they introduce testing. It seems a lot easier relative to what we do. There's West Nile, we introduce West Nile. If there's law, we do it nationally. It may not be necessary to do that, but I mean, we have standardization, which, some would argue is maybe not needed, but, there are a lot of ways to approach a problem. Whether we survey the literature, do horizon scanning, have committees that do it through our voluntary accrediting associations like the AABB. The ISBT isn't as much involved, but the AABB is a stakeholder. So between public health, CDC, the FDA, AABB, and the blood providers, we try to reach consensus about what we do if, as Lou laid out the conditions, there is an agent that is transfusion transmissible, survives our blood processing, causes a dread disease like Zika did. We have an intervention. So, what are the conditions we need to move something forward? And sometimes it's quite complicated, like Zika. We kind of didn't resist, but there were many questions before we implemented national testing. For West Nile, we just did it. We knew it was transfusion transmitted. We knew it was expanding. The same thing with Babesia, although expanding much more slowly. So, I mean, with each agent, the conditions have been a little bit different. And with each part of the world, conditions are a little bit different. So there is no Arthur Murray dance steps that we can take. You do A, B, and C. We know there's transfusion transmission. We know there's disease. We know the pathogen survives our blood processing. So there's something that has to be done.
Yeah.
I like to comment. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Silvano.
Okay, yeah, I couldn't agree more with Susan, but I like to add two more points. Another very strong factor for decision of testing or whatever in order to prevent is also patients association. If you have a strong patient association worried about their own conditions, and of course that was maybe 40 years ago, but we cannot forget that part of the French issue concerning HIV came from the hemophiliacs that raised the alarm in that particular country. And the main lesson from what I heard from Sue is that there's not a single solution for every country. So it is very important that you use your own tools, whether regulatory, whether associations, whether universities or technology or whatever, but based on your own conditions. So it's not because, for instance, in Brazil, we have tested for Chagas since the 60s. And in the US was, I think it's for 2000 or 1999, something like that. So
2006.
It changes according to each region. Even in a given country, you might have one condition in one area and different in another one. So you have to use your own data and all resources, intellectual and technological, and even financial, in order to find a final solution for that particular country or region. Over.
Yeah, the two things that I think are important way up front are to push surveillance out into the field as close to the new places where humans are invading ecological niches we haven't been in, so that if something starts to emerge in the Andes, a new arbovirus or a newly recognized arbovirus, that we're looking for the agent in blood very early on. That the people that are on the ground, wherever the emergence is occurring, is looking for the agent in blood, and where possible to exploit donor populations in those areas. start very, very close to the ground. And it will frequently give us months and even years of lead time to think about things. Now, COVID was different. We didn't have a lot of time, but particularly with the arboviruses, I think thinking about, is it in blood and then is it in donors very early on can be valuable. Costs money, and it means making investigators who don't think about the blood supply aware, but we can do that, I think.
I think that you highlight the importance of how monitoring the safety of blood is really generally a global public health issue that a lot of people don't think about, and how we could use the transfusion medicine community to understand just epidemiology and infectious disease in general. You're so closely involved in the Iowa public health, and who knows, maybe in many. Can you share with us that the importance of your relationship as a physician, as a transfusion medicine specialist, even though you'll say, I'm not a blood banker, I'm not a lab rat. But can you share with us how important that relationship is? And perhaps Silvano, Susan, you also have your own personal key relationships with the public health or government agencies, etc.
Well, mine's a little bit odd because when I'm thinking about transfusion transmitted diseases, then I call myself on the phone at the health department and say, what do you think about this? My real life is as an ID doc and public health person, and transfusion medicine just paid better. So, but talking to public health, and again, I use the term astute clinicians. It's very, very important that when somebody sees an infection they didn't expect, one of the things we should be asking, and I'm at the university, they stopped listening to me when I asked the fellows, you always take a transfusion history when you see an oddball infection, and they think I'm, a broken record. But starting with that and then talking to public health to develop ideas about plausibility, how to do surveillance is critical. The interface is critical.
Well, I could say that, as Lou mentioned, surveillance is key. If you don't, and not only in blood transfusion scenario, but in the as a whole, not only public health, but any part of medicine, that is very, very important. Sometimes a new point is raised by a surgeon or by a clinician. So SARS came from a physician. SARS-CoV-2 also came from a Chinese doctor that, and the public health somehow were not paying attention. But once again, it is important that it is a combination of groups responsible for that. Clearly, in my own country, when I started blood transfusion, I was somehow disappointed with these emergent diseases. For instance, HIV became mandatory 3 or 4 years after a suitable test was available. But with dengue was a problem. On the other hand, I have to salute the public authorities for Zika, for instance. The role that public health performed in Zika in this country was phenomenal. They really understood, and they really raised the alert for pregnant women and the problems for babies infected. So I think that it is a continuous aspect of learning, correcting your own mistakes, listening to other people as well. So this is very, very important. Over.
Okay. There are many facets of surveillance. So I think nationwide and worldwide, there are good surveillance avenues. Of course, we have CDC, WHO, but, looking at PAHO, they do a really fantastic job, I think, in taking a very disparate set of countries in the Americas and putting data together. So we can look at horizon scanning and that type of surveillance, but then we can take it the next step and do surveillance in donors. Of course, we mentioned all of this costs money. We need tools, highly multiplexed assays that we can look for nucleic acids in donors, but we're going to find them. We're going to find them for hundreds of arboviruses because we will get infected. I mean, that's the natural cycle. Mosquitoes or other vectors will bite us, we'll become infected. But then comparably, we have to link those studies to surveillance studies in recipients to see if we can tie any of these infections to clinical conditions that we may not routinely see in recipients. That's the way all of these infectious agents, whether it's showing that Zika was transfusion transmitted or West Nile or dengue, whether there's a clinical outcome, that's another story. But all of this needs to be integrated. And Lou mentioned, you can develop flow diagrams to determine your course of action after you have a horizon scanning. You identify a pathogen. Is it transfusion transmitted? Can you find it in donor blood? What are the rates that you find it in donor blood? And then you've got to link this to recipients. And we do this all hand in hand with public health. I mean, no one is excluded, and you can't do this in isolation. So whatever studies we do, I mean, we have worked with the CDC on lots of different agents. Poisson, this is a tick-borne arbovirus, but nonetheless, I mean, it again, organ recipients are really a sentinel.
Yep.
They receive transfusions. So we had one in Indiana who got a transfusion from someone who was infected in Wisconsin, where Poisson is endemic. So, I mean, all of the blood centers, along with public health, the organ transplant community, all of these need to play a pivotal role in working together. But just to say that we don't expect another arbovirus in the blood supply is naive, because there are hundreds, perhaps thousands of arboviruses. And that's only one small niche of pathogens. There'll be more respiratory pathogens. We were lucky with SARS, MERS, SARS-CoV-2, flu. None of these have been transfusion transmitted, although you can find RNA. Even Lou and I were involved in a review for leprosy. You can find leprosy nucleic acids, but does that mean it's transfusion transmitted? I mean, all of these things need to be carefully integrated, and there'll be a lot of false alarms. I mean, if you look for stuff in blood, you're going to find it. It doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Is it part of our normal flora? Is it a pathogen? So, I mean, all of these things need careful integration from public health through our regulators, through the blood centers, through recipient groups, whether they're the hemophiliac groups or the organ recipient communities. There's just a lot of integration. And I think if we step back, I mean, we may have missed things historically, but over time, I think worldwide, we've done a pretty incredible job, maybe HIV being the exception. But that was the first one that really caught us very much off guard. In Japan, they actually save a repository. I think it's a rolling repository for 5 years on the island of Hokkaido. And, so that if there is a suspected case, even a suspected case of things we test for, agents we test for, there's a repository to go back to and test the the donor samples and then the recipient samples to look for linkage. These things cost vast amounts of money and other resources. So that's nothing we're going to do worldwide, but that's another approach that one country has taken. And if you look at the evolution of NAT in Japan, that really enabled them to follow HPV, to the point of where they went from large pools to now doing individual donation testing. But anyway, just to use that as an example of, the successes we've had.
Yeah, and that it was a focus of the State of the Science Symposium at NIH last fall, and I think it'll be in TMR. Our summary of those sessions will be in TMR, Transfusion Medicine Reviews, fairly soon. But the title was Leveraging Donor Populations for these kinds of efforts. And doing that systematically will give us lead time, if we're able to afford it, before another disaster like HIV would come along.
Yeah, one thing that gives me hope, if we look for the past 15 years, from all the menaces and threats that the human nature or the human beings were suffering, is that we now have tools to respond for any real threat as far as blood transfusion is concerned very quickly. So we had the response from West Nile. I remember that was the first very fast response, technologically speaking, in order to protect the blood supply. Then we had tools for preventing Zika in case that was really a major issue, or dengue, or even COVID. We had tests available very, very, very early. So in case we suffer a new threat, an unknown threat, I think that technologically we do have the tools to prevent it very quickly, and not mentioning pathogen inactivation or procedures that probably you're going to discuss in the future.
Yes.
So I'm optimistic. Humans will always suffer from threats, and if we want to survive, we have to adapt and use our knowledge how to adapt for these different conditions.
It brings to mind that I trained before PCR, and the availability of nucleic acid amplification has been an enormous game changer in terms of our ability to pivot very quickly and intervene. And I think Sue's about my age as well, and knows how difficult it is to develop a great serologic test. And we now have incredibly sensitive and specific tools leveraging nucleic acid amplification, are really a huge game changer.
Well, and we have to also balance that with pathogen inactivation. I mean, Silvano was one of the first hospitals worldwide, and maybe I don't know about the landscape in Brazil, but for platelets, having implemented what the available technology to eliminate or certainly control pathogens has been, a technological advancement. And hopefully one day we'll have universal pathogen reduction. Unfortunately, all the agents we're talking about today are very, very susceptible to being killed by these agents. So we're not talking about parvovirus or hepatitis A or HEV, but I mean, arboviruses, they should be easily remedied by something like a universal pathogen reduction system. So, I think, as Silvano said, whether it's the Black Plague or the Black Death, humans have prevailed. We're still here.
Yeah, for good or for bad.
Otherwise, we won't be here.
Yeah.
Well,
So I think all of you just touched on several things that we learned over the last decades in terms of developing new diagnostic tools and identifying diseases and identifying susceptible hosts and so on. One other thing that I would like to ask you is we talk about pathogen inactivation as well. What about the other technologies, like just also learning from COVID, right? Early diagnosis was key. And the second thing, as Silvano was mentioning, developing the vaccine. I think those two were the game changers of the pandemic. So looking into the future, what do you think in terms of vaccine coming up, number one? And the second question is about training the next generation of physicians that will follow your path How do you see that coming?
Well, I have a strong sense that the nucleic acid-based vaccines that came along so quickly for COVID are going to be comparable in vaccinology to what PCR was for diagnostics and screening. The ability to develop a safe vaccine literally in weeks and get it into clinical trials is going to be a big deal. But it's very expensive, and it's really in the hands of large companies that need to demonstrate a profit, and so there are some big barriers. The threat from the infection has to be greater than it may be transfusion transmitted. We're not going to drive vaccinology with our concerns, but I think we're entering a new era with nucleic acid vaccines that's going to be really spectacular. I'm very hopeful.
Yeah, and
I
closing up,
agree.
I'm sorry.
I'm a strong supporter of vaccines, and as mentioned by Lou, now we have a new group of vaccines, but any vaccine that really works is always welcome. Uh, of course, it takes time to validate the vaccines, and sometimes we have to learn that we have to take vaccines every year or every other year or every 10 years. It really uh, changes according to the pathogen, but clearly vaccine is one of the ultimate solutions for controlling infectious diseases. I don't think it's the only one or will be the final one, because there will always be some escapes, but that would be for the minority or very rare cases. So it's not going to be a menace, I would say.
I agree. For this group of agents, vaccines will be really, really important. Although things like dengue that have multiple serotypes, I mean, it's been really a challenge for with some of these agents. I mean, we'll still need mosquito control, or vector control as possible where vector control can be applied. There are many ways to deal with, how mosquitoes, for example, process the parasites and can pass it on to its progeny. So, yielding, sterile male mosquitoes, or, there are lots of evolving technologies. Vaccines as an intervention are clearly the answer, but one answer, but we'll also need a balance of other ways that we manage what we're seeing in climate and other ways that we deal with pathogens that don't respond to vaccines or for which we've been unsuccessful. HIV and HCV, where we control infection with antivirals. So, whether it's treatment or whether it's vaccination or we control our vectors, just like everything else, it's multifaceted and it really will depend on the agent.
And we have also to control the anti-vaxxers as well.
Yeah, I know. I was thinking that.
Good luck.
Culturally, that is also a problem.
Yeah,
anyway, it's beyond the transfusion medicine issue.
I have to get your guys' opinions because we have just a few minutes left of this, and I love Monica's last question. I would love your opinion. We've got three incredible individuals giving us this expert advice. What advice do you give to the younger trainees who want to get involved in this area? Very different backgrounds of each one of you in terms of your training. What types of skills or education do you think is needed today to be in this field, this very specialized field of hemovigilance, infectious disease testing, microbiology, whatever amalgamation you want to call it, what you do? What do the younger people need today to become experts in the future?
Well, sorry, Lou, go on.
Well, I have a little bit of academic involvement these days, and And it hasn't changed since I trained. It's having good mentors that think about our issues. And if you got good mentors to think about our issues, the questions are fascinating. Who wouldn't want to do it? But somebody's has to make the connection between the bug and the bag of blood in the blood bank. And if you do that, you'll get people. Mike Bush has probably been as good as anybody in the world ever as an exemplar of the kind of career that you can have if you just make the connection.
Could you tell us more about who that is?
Who Mike Bush is?
Yeah, for
Everybody
those of
knows
us that don't know.
Oh, well, you know, Mike's trained at University of California, and very early on with Herb Perkins at the Irwin Memorial Blood Center in San Francisco, began looking into what was happening with HIV. And the questions were fascinating. And Mike and Sue and Roger Dodd and Steve Kleiman, a whole bunch of people in the US, said these are fascinating questions. They're important questions. And, you know, then you investigate them using the scientific process. Well, if the mentors will make the case to the ID docs and the pathologists and the epidemiologists, the microbiologists, these are important research questions, and they'll get people published and get people's thesis completed, and it'll work. But make the connection.
You know, we also in the professional associations getting people involved in committees, whether
Yep.
at AABB or ISBT. And then another, in my opinion, the best program we have in the United States is at CDC through the Epidemic Intelligence Service. If you're really interested, I've had folks in my group become EIS officers. I was at CDC a long time ago, and I thought of a career in EIS or as a way to launch your career. If you're really interested in all the topics we talked about, that's what you do. I mean, their symbol is a footprint where you go and you investigate these outbreaks. I mean, EIS officers have been involved in everything. If you look at some of the papers that we've referenced, the first lead author was an EIS officer at the CDC. So, I mean, we need to get people encouraged to take our profession. We need mentors, and we need programs for which they can develop their careers.
And those interested in becoming EIS officers, what is their their background in terms of university? Like, do you need a biology and what?
You can be an MD, you can be a PhD. Yeah. You're just interested in investigating epidemics or what we believe is a potential epidemic.
The doc running the Office of Blood, Organ, and Other Tissue Safety at CDC right now is an ER doc, right? But he got interested for some reason or other, and the rest is history.
Yeah, I would like to add, apart from what Lou and Sue commented, is that be alert, be well communicate, be well connected, I would say. But if you're working on infectious disease, never neglect the past. That is a very important issue, because if we forget the past, the infectious diseases won't forget, and they will repeat what has been somehow placed in humanity many years ago. So be alert from the past and look for the future.
Yeah, it's totally probably agree. The first thing I tell a resident is the bugs are always smarter than us, and Darwin always wins. So
always,
yeah,
always.
You have to make the connections.
That's a great way to end this. I can't thank you enough, Monica. Any last statements also?
Yeah, well, again, thank you so much, the three of you. I think it provided us a very nice perspective of how complex the topic is, considering donors, recipients, pathogen, interactions, public health, climate change, and everything, education, and everything that goes with it. So thank you so much for working on this, for actually being the hands and brains, taking care of our blood supply. And thank you also for joining us on this episode of Baristas.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Welcome.
you. It was a real pleasure.
Good to see old friends too.
Yes, always.
Old, the emphasis on old.
Are we on or off now for the public, Daniela?
We are still recording, but in 3, 2, 1, bye to everybody.
Okay. You know, my son is at Darwin College now in Cambridge.